Can you imagine the pain of discovering that your own children, the people you raised and loved, only see you as a burden? I witnessed a secret that few families dare to admit. A child's love can be as fragile as the money that sustains it. And sometimes, the only loyalty that matters comes from where you least expect it. Imagine a woman who spent her entire life building a legacy, only to be humiliated by those who were supposed to protect her. That's what happened to Dowa Teresa Dodd and Anne. Instant, the opulence of her house became a prison of hurt. But today, I'm going to show you how that humiliation was the turning point for a silent, monumental revenge that shocked everyone and changed one person's life forever. Every second counts, because if you ignore this lesson, you risk never recognizing the loyalty that truly surrounds you. Stay with me until the end and discover the radical decision that Dowa Teresa made. The decision that traded an entire inheritance for an act of love and justice. My name is Teresa Valdiviso, and I'm 85 years old. I was born in Madrid, in one of those stately homes that barely exist anymore, between marble columns and stained glass windows that told stories when sunlight touched them. I've lived my entire life in the same house where I first opened my eyes, took my first steps, and buried my husband. That house is more than a building, it's a living archive of everything I once was. People call it a mansion, but to me, it's just home. The rooms still carry the smell of lavender and old wood, and sometimes I can almost hear the piano my mother used to play in the evenings. I've always carried myself with a certain pride, not arrogance, no, but the quiet composure that comes from being taught to never slouch, never shout, and never beg. My hair is always tied in a neat low bun, and even now, I insist on wearing pressed blouses and my mother's pearl earrings, though my hands are slower and my spine isn't what it used to be. When I walk through the long halls of the house, I feel like a ghost drifting through the memories of a time when people spoke with intention and kissed each other's hands. My husband, Enrique, died 17 years ago. He was a man of business, strict and silent, but loyal to the bone. Since his death, this house has become both my fortress and my prison. My two children, Ricardo and Ana, visit me occasionally, mostly to ask about bills, or to sigh loudly when I mention repairs. They look at the paintings on the walls and the silverware in the dining room like vultures circling an animal that's still breathing. Their visits never last long. I used to pretend I didn't notice the impatience in their voices, but I'm not deaf nor blind, nor stupid. The only constant in my life has been Berta. She came to work here when she was just 30, after her husband left her with a daughter to raise. Now she's 50, with hands that know this house better than anyone. Berta doesn't speak unless necessary, but when she does, her voice is warm and solid like a fireplace on a winter night. She brings me tea every morning without needing to ask how I want it. She knows when I need company and when I want silence. In all these years, she's never once looked at me like I was a burden. It was a Tuesday morning when everything began to change. I remember because the sunlight through the library window was unusually golden, and the clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. I was seated at the breakfast table, stirring my coffee slowly, when I decided to bring it up. We should consider selling the house, I said aloud, even though only Berta was in the room. It's too big, too cold. And I'm too old. She didn't say anything right away, just placed a hand gently on my shoulder and nodded, as if she had been waiting for me to say it. Later that afternoon, Ricardo and Ana came by. I had asked them to, told them I had something important to discuss. They arrived with their usual rushed energy, dropping their bags on the armchairs like it was a hotel lobby. I waited until we were all seated in the drawing room on the velvet couch, Ana tapping her phone, Ricardo checking his watch before repeating what I had said earlier. I want to sell the house and move to a smaller flat, somewhere easier to manage. The silence was immediate, followed by a sharp laugh from Ricardo. You're joking, right? He said, not even trying to hide his disgust. Ana looked up from her phone and blinked at me like I'd lost my mind. Mother, this house is our inheritance, she said, as if that should have been the end of the conversation. You can't just give it away. I opened my mouth to explain, to say that the maintenance was overwhelming, that I was tired of feeling like a museum exhibit, but Ricardo cut me off with a tone I had never heard before. You're too old to have a say in this, he snapped. The house is our future. Stop making things complicated. I sat there, staring at him. My son, the boy I once held against my chest during thunderstorms. And I felt something break cleanly, quietly, like porcelain in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just folded my hands in my lap and looked at them both like I was seeing strangers. Ana crossed her legs and gave me a tight-lipped smile, as if trying to placate a senile old woman. We understand that you're overwhelmed, Mama, she said in that syrupy voice she saves for people she thinks are beneath her. But the house stays. It's part of the family legacy. It's not just yours anymore. That last sentence echoed in the room like a slap. I think it was in that exact moment sitting between two people who had my blood, but not my heart, that something inside me settled. Not out of rage, not even sadness. It was clarity. They weren't here for me. They hadn't been for years. I had just been a gatekeeper, a living obstacle between them and their fantasy of wealth. I nodded slowly, murmured something about being tired, and they took it as a cue to leave. Berta helped me to my room that evening. I didn't say much and she didn't press. But before she turned out the light, she touched my hand again and said softly, "You deserve peace, Dowa Teresa." Not this. After she left, I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. My mind replayed Ricardo's voice, his contempt, Anna's coldness, their eyes filled with entitlement instead of love. And then, like a flame catching the edge of dry paper, an idea sparked in me. The next morning, I called my lawyer, a discreet man, Don Mateo Galvez, who had handled our family's legal matters for decades. I told him I wanted to initiate the process of donating the house not to my children, but to Berta. There was a pause on the line, but no questions. He knew me well enough to know I never spoke lightly. "I understood," he said. "We'll proceed with urgency and full discretion." I felt a calmness I hadn't known in years. Over the following days, we worked quietly. Papers were drawn, transfers prepared. Don Mateo came to the house under the pretense of reviewing routine documents. Berta had no idea. I didn't tell her yet. Not because I doubted her, but because I wanted the act to be clean, final, and mine. It was not a gift born of pity. It was justice, recognition for 2 decades of loyalty, warmth, and dignity. On the day I signed the final papers, the house was silent as ever. I wore one of my old dresses, navy blue with mother-of-pearl buttons, and sat in the study where Enrique used to conduct his business. I signed without trembling. Don Mateo nodded solemnly, packed the documents, and told me it was done. Just like that, the house that had belonged to my family for generations now belonged to the one person who had never asked for anything. I asked Berta to come to the library later that evening. She walked in wiping her hands on her apron, hair tied back as always, and stood in front of me with her usual gentle patience. "There is something I need to tell you," I said, and I could feel my throat tighten, not out of regret, but out of the weight of what I was about to give. "This house, it's yours now, Berta. I've signed it over to you." She blinked, frowned, and then gave a soft, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No, Dowa Teresa, that can't be," she whispered, voice already trembling. I took her hands in mine, rough, warm. Relan held her gaze. "It can. It is. You've taken care of me like no one else ever has, and they don't deserve it. But you do." Her eyes filled with tears, and mine did too. But this time, they weren't born from sadness. They were born from something that felt a lot like freedom. Berta didn't speak for a long time. Her eyes were wide, mouth slightly open, and her hands trembled in mine. "But what will people say?" she finally whispered, looking down as if ashamed of even considering it. "Let them talk," I replied calmly. "They've always talked, but they weren't the ones who stayed." I could feel her disbelief, her fear of stepping into a world that never belonged to her. But I also saw something else, something that had been buried under years of submission, dignity. Later that night, she knocked on my bedroom door. I was already in bed, reading an old poetry book I hadn't touched in years. She stepped in shyly and asked if she could sit for a while. I nodded. We didn't speak much. She just sat in the armchair near the window, looking out into the garden like she'd never really seen it before. I watched her in the dim light, and for the first time, I realized how tired she looked. Not physically, but emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that comes from always being the one who bends so others don't break. The next day, I asked her to take the morning off. She looked confused, but I insisted. "Go into the city," I said. "Walk as the owner of something, even if you don't feel it yet." She hesitated, then nodded, putting on her best coat, the dark gray one with worn sleeves. I watched her leave through the front door, standing tall, and for once not looking over her shoulder. As the door closed behind her, I let out a long breath. The house felt different. Not emptier, just lighter. Ricardo called that afternoon. I didn't answer. Then Anna sent a message, heard the lawyer came by. "Is everything all right?" I stared at the phone for a long time, then placed it face down on the table. I didn't owe them explanations anymore. For years, I had tiptoed around their moods, their impatience, their greed disguised as concern. Not anymore. That day, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was liberating. When Berta returned, she had a paper bag in her hand. She bought pastries from a bakery near Retiro Park. "I walked for almost 2 hours," she said, laughing nervously. "Felt strange. People looked at me differently. Or maybe I was just walking differently." I smiled, watching her unwrap the pastries like it was Christmas. We sat in the kitchen, the one Space in the house that never pretended to be anything other than what it was and ate in silence. That night, I wrote a letter to Ricardo and Anna. Not to provoke them, not even to explain, just to tell the truth. I told them the house was no longer theirs to wait for, that it had gone to someone who had truly lived inside its walls, not just visited for its chandeliers and inheritance value. I didn't sign the letter with Mom. I signed it with my full name. Because for once, I wasn't writing as their mother. I was writing as a woman who had finally made a choice. The letter was sent the next morning by courier. I imagined their faces when they read it, the disbelief, the fury, the phone calls that would never be returned. I didn't feel satisfaction, just a deep, aching peace, like a wound that had been cleaned, even if it still stung. Berta brewed coffee, humming to herself as she watered the plants in the sunroom. She didn't ask about the letter. She didn't need to, she knew. Around midday, the front gate buzzed. I saw Anna through the monitor, pacing, her mouth tight, arms crossed. I didn't answer. She rang again, and again. Eventually, she left. Not a word spoken. Just footsteps down the walkway and the engine of her car fading into the distance. I watched it all from the upstairs window. Then I closed the curtain. That evening, I sat alone in the sitting room, the same room where they had once fought over wedding china and old wine bottles they believed were worth a fortune. The ticking of the clock sounded louder than usual. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and stared at the fireplace, unlit but still heavy with the scent of past winters. I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I was thinking about legacy, and how sometimes the truest legacy has nothing to do with blood. I remembered when Berta first arrived. Her daughter had a fever, and she was too afraid to ask for an advance on her salary. I had heard her crying in the pantry. That night, I left an envelope under her pillow. She never mentioned it, but the next morning, she cooked breakfast humming softly as if the world had shifted just a little. That's when I knew she was different. Not just a servant, a presence, a soul with weight. The day after Anna left the gate, Ricardo called 3 times. Then came a message: "We need to talk." This is not acceptable. The words didn't sting like I thought they would. They felt like noise from another life. I deleted the message and blocked his number. It was surprisingly easy. I realized then how little of them I had left inside me. I had spent years preserving a connection that had long since crumbled into dust. Berta asked me that afternoon if I was okay. I told her the truth. I don't know what I am, but for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid. She sat beside me, folded a blanket over my knees, and said nothing. Just being there was enough. In that silence, I found something more powerful than comfort. I found presence. Later that week, I received a letter not from my children, but from a neighbor, old Don Federico, who had heard the news. "Teresa," he wrote in shaky script, "you have done something most people only dream of. You've broken a cycle." I smiled as I read it. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but he was right. The cycle of appeasement, of generational greed, of silence in the face of cruelty, it had ended with me. I started noticing things I hadn't in years. The way sunlight moved through the curtains in the morning, the creak of the second stair from the top, the way Berta rearranged the flowers in the foyer every Monday, always choosing the freshest white lilies. These were details of a home, not a tomb. And slowly, I began to feel alive within these walls again, not as a relic, but as a woman reclaiming her place. The papers had already been filed. Legally, there was no going back. Don Mateo assured me the donation was airtight. "They can try to contest it," he said, "but it will be futile." I asked him not to tell me if they did. I didn't want to waste one more minute of my remaining life on bitterness. Let them scream into their lawyers' phones. I had already moved on. Berta began sleeping in the guest room closest to mine by her own choice. "Just in case you need anything in the night," she said. I knew it wasn't just about proximity. It was about stepping into something she wasn't ready to name yet. Ownership. Stewardship. A life lived not in service, but in worth. That Sunday morning, I asked Berta to join me for breakfast in the garden. It was something I hadn't done in years. The table was already set under the fig tree with fresh bread, soft cheese, and 2 porcelain cups I hadn't used since Enrique passed. She hesitated at first, unsure if it was appropriate, but I patted the seat beside me and said, "Please, don't make me eat alone today." She sat, and in that small act, something shifted between us, not in status, but in closeness. We spoke of ordinary things, how the fig tree had finally started bearing fruit again, how the pigeons had built another nest in the roof tiles. But underneath it all, I could feel the air had changed. I was no longer just the Segura of the house, and she was no longer just the help. We were 2 women, tired but upright, sitting in the ruins and the bloom of what remained. There was peace in that moment, not loud or triumphant, but deep and warm like the sun on my back. That afternoon, I opened the old wardrobe in Enrique's study. Inside were files, blueprints, letters, and notes, things from decades ago. I went through them slowly, with no real goal except to understand what I was leaving behind. I found an envelope labeled for Teresa, but when I opened it, it was empty. I smiled. That was just like him, always mysterious, always starting things he never finished. I closed the wardrobe and decided to leave it be. Some endings don't need answers. The house had always felt too large for one woman. But now, as Berta moved through it with a new kind of presence, choosing curtains, planning repairs, placing bowls of fruit in the hall, it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. She was careful not to overstep. Every decision she made, she ran by me. But I began to tell her, if it feels right to you, do it. She had earned the right to decide. And I had learned to let go. Then came the letter from Ricardo's lawyer. Delivered formally, sealed with arrogance. It accused me of mental incompetence, claimed I had been manipulated, suggested a full investigation. I read it once. Then I set it on fire in the fireplace, watching the flames curl the edges of the paper until nothing remained but gray ash. Berta stood silently nearby, waiting to see my reaction. I looked at her and said, I'm not afraid of them. And I wasn't. Anna showed up 2 days later. No call. No warning. Just rang the bell like a stranger. When Berta answered the door, Anna stared at her as if she committed a crime. Where is she? She snapped. I was already walking down the hall. Anna turned to me, furious, but her eyes betrayed something else, disbelief. You gave her the house, she hissed. Are you out of your mind? I took a deep breath and said, no. For once I'm in it. She went on about legacy, about betrayal, about shame. But her words fell like coins into a well that no longer echoed. I let her speak. Let her empty herself. When she was done, I simply said, I spent a lifetime giving. This is the first time I gave something that felt right. She looked like she wanted to cry, but didn't. Instead, she turned and left. Not a goodbye, just the slam of the door. I sat back down in the living room, trembling a little, but not from fear, from relief. I had said what needed to be said. I had stood for myself. And as the house settled into its usual silence, Berta came in with a blanket, wrapping it around my shoulders without a word. That's the kind of love that doesn't ask for applause. The kind that stays. A few days later, I received another letter, this time handwritten. It was from Ricardo. Not his lawyer, not typed, not formal. Just ink on paper, uneven and hurried. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit fault. But the tone was different. He wrote, I don't understand why you did this. I thought we were family. I read that line over and over. I thought we were family. It hurt more than I expected. Not because I doubted my choice, but because I realized how distant we truly were. That night, I sat in the study, turning the letter in my hands. Berta came in quietly, bringing me a cup of warm milk, an old habit she picked up from my husband. I didn't say anything, just handed her the letter. She read it once, then handed it back, her face unreadable. He's confused, she said softly. People get cruel when they're confused. Doesn't mean you have to carry it. I nodded, grateful for her steadiness. She always knew how to bring me back to center. The next morning, I instructed Don Mateo to send Ricardo a formal notice. The decision was final and legally binding. There would be no mediation, no renegotiation, no room for guilt or manipulation. I asked that it be written with dignity, but clarity. No emotion, just law. I wanted my children to understand that silence wasn't weakness, it was finality. Life in the house began to change in small, quiet ways. Berta moved her things into the old guest suite, though she still knocked. Before entering any room, she cleaned differently now, not with the routine of a servant, but with the care of someone preserving something she loved. I saw her place a framed photo of her daughter on the hallway table. I didn't ask permission. I simply nodded at it and smiled. It felt right. I started sleeping better, not because the air was lighter or the nights quieter, they were the same, but because the heaviness in my chest was gone. For years, I had clung to the illusion that love meant enduring, that motherhood meant sacrificing until the last breath. But now, I was learning something new, that boundaries can be loved too. That justice is not the opposite of forgiveness, it's the beginning of peace. One morning, Berta brought me breakfast on a tray with a single flower in a glass. From the garden, she said. It was a small gesture, but it touched me more than any grand gift. I realized no one had brought me flowers in years. Not for birthdays, not for holidays. And yet here was Berta, offering me beauty for no reason other than kindness. As spring rolled in, the house filled with light again. We opened windows. We scrubbed curtains. We polished the silverware that hadn't been touched since my daughter's wedding. Not because we had guests coming, but because we wanted to live in a space that felt awake. The house was no longer a monument to what had been. It was becoming a home again. One afternoon, I found Berta in the library, sitting in one of the old armchairs, reading a book I hadn't seen touched in decades. She looked up, startled. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." I interrupted her with a wave of my hand. "You belong here," I said. "You always have." I was just the last to realize it. Days passed quietly, but not uneventfully. One morning, as I was tending to the roses in the side garden, something I hadn't done since before Enrique died, I heard a car pull up. It wasn't the postman or the grocer. It was Anna again. She got out alone, holding a small box and wearing a look I hadn't seen on her face in years. It wasn't anger. It wasn't entitlement. It was hesitation. I met her at the steps, wiping the dirt from my gloves. "I didn't come to fight," she said. "Can I come in?" I studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. We walked into the salon without speaking. Berta, sensing the weight in the air, quietly left us alone. Anna sat on the edge of the couch like a child afraid of being scolded. "I brought some of your old letters," she said, opening the box. "Ones you wrote to Dad." I found them cleaning out some old drawers. I reached into the box with trembling fingers. The paper smelled of dust and faint perfume. I didn't remember writing half of them, but as I skimmed through the first few lines, I saw a version of myself I had forgotten. A younger woman, passionate, worried, loving. I looked up and met Anna's eyes. "Why did you bring these?" I asked gently. She shrugged. "Because I think I forgot who you were, and I needed to." Remember, for the first time in many years, we spoke without raised voices or rehearsed speeches. She told me she felt like I had chosen a stranger over her. I told her I had chosen someone who stayed. That it wasn't about revenge, it was about recognition. "You and your brother stopped seeing me as a person," I said. "I stopped mattering once the inheritance became more real than my breath." She didn't deny it. She just cried, quietly, like someone who had finally run out of justifications. Before she left, I placed one of the letters back in her hand, one where I'd written about the day she was born. "Read this when you forget," I told her. She nodded and walked out without asking for the house back, without promising to visit more. And yet, something had shifted. Maybe she wouldn't change. Maybe she would. But I no longer waited for her to. That evening, Berta asked me if I was all right. I said yes, but added something I hadn't said in years. "I'm proud of myself." Her eyes softened. "You should be," she replied. And in that short exchange, I felt seen in a way that went far beyond blood ties or legal documents. I felt seen as a woman who had made a choice and stood by it. Later that week, we hosted a small lunch, just Berta, her daughter Lucia, and me. We used the good china, not because it was a special occasion, but because every day had started to feel like one. Lucia brought wine, and Berta cooked a tortilla espanola that reminded me of my mother's. We laughed out, we shared stories. And for the first time in years, the house echoed with joy, not tension. That night, before going to bed, I stopped in the hallway and touched the walls with my fingers. The same walls that had heard my silence for so long. Now, they listened to something else, a soft hum of healing, of life returning not with noise, but with truth. I whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular, and finally, I slept without dreaming of what I had lost. The following week brought a letter from the city council. They wanted to recognize the house as a historic residence, given its age and architectural value. I chuckled when I read it. For decades, no one cared what happened inside these walls, but now, suddenly, they were interested in preservation. I called Don Mateo and asked if it would complicate anything for Berta. He assured me it wouldn't. It's still hers. No title changes that. I brought the letter to Berta and watched her eyes widen. "They want to call this a heritage site," she said, half laughing. "This place where I mopped floors and peeled potatoes for 20 years. I nodded. "That same place. Because even the city can tell this house matters." She shook her head in disbelief. But I could see it, a flicker of pride, deep and genuine, blooming in her chest. It wasn't about the house itself. It was about being acknowledged. One afternoon, I saw her walking along the upstairs corridor with a notebook, jotting things down. "What are you planning?" I asked from my armchair. She smiled shyly. "Just organizing. Repairs. Paint. Maybe a small music room, if you don't mind." I laughed out loud. If I minded, it'd be too late. She blushed, but I saw how serious she was. She was beginning to dream. That, more than anything, told me I'd done the right thing. The neighbors started talking, of course. Whispers about the maid who owns the mansion now. Some were cruel, others curious. A few, like old Don Federico, came by with warm congratulations. But most just watched from a distance, unsure how to place what had happened. It didn't matter. Let them talk. Let them wonder. They weren't here during the empty winters. They didn't hear my children's voices when they turned cold. Berta never flaunted it. She never changed her tone, her clothes, or her habits. She still rose early, still brewed tea exactly the way I liked. But there was a lightness in her step now, a quiet ownership that came not from paper or keys, but from knowing she belonged. She moved through the halls like someone finally allowed to exist without shrinking, and that alone made all the noise outside irrelevant. As summer approached, we began spending more time on the terrace. The breeze carried scents from the garden, and the stone walls radiated warmth from the afternoon sun. We played old records, ones Enrique had hidden away, and Berta would sometimes hum along. I sat with a shawl over my shoulders, feet tucked under me, watching her sweep the terrace like it was a stage. And maybe it was her stage now. One day, I asked her, "Do you regret it? Any of this?" She looked surprised. "Regret what? Taking this on," I said, gesturing to the house, the weight, the story. She thought for a moment. "No," she said. "Only that it took so long for you to believe I deserved it," I nodded slowly. "That makes two of us." That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the same ceiling I'd stared at for nearly a lifetime. But this time, I didn't feel like a relic beneath it. I felt like a witness to a story that had finally turned the page. And somewhere in that silence, I found peace not just with my children, but with myself. A few weeks later, I received a formal invitation from the Historical Society. They wanted to host a small gathering at the house, a sort of cultural afternoon to celebrate its designation as a protected site. I handed the letter to Berta. "They're not asking for me," I said. "They're asking for the house." But she shook her head. "No, they're asking because you lived here. Because this place tells your story," I smiled. "Then it tells yours too." We prepared together. Berta chose the flowers, I polished the silver. We debated over music. She wanted something soft in Spanish. I wanted Chopin. We compromised, alternating tracks. That day, for the first time in decades, the house filled with people who came not to demand, but to listen. Neighbors, historians, even a few strangers who admired old architecture. They wandered the halls in awe. But my favorite moment was watching Berta speak to them, not as staff, but as hostess. When someone asked if the rumors were true, if she really was the new owner, she didn't boast. She just said, "This house chose me in a way." I watched her from across the room, heart full. There was no resentment in her tone, no bitterness, just quiet truth. And in that moment, I realized something. I didn't feel displaced. I felt proud that night, after the last guest left and the house grew still again. We sat on the steps of the front porch drinking lemonade. The air was warm, the stars unusually bright. "Do you miss them?" Berta asked gently. I knew who she meant. I didn't answer right away. "I miss who I thought they were," I said. But I stopped expecting them to be anything else from time to time. I still receive cold texts from Anna. Short, clipped messages about paperwork or family names. Ricardo has gone silent. But I no longer dread their names appearing on my phone. I don't rush to respond. I stopped trying to keep a broken table set for guests who never truly came hungry for love. I started writing again. Just little things. Notes, thoughts, sometimes whole pages I don't show anyone. Memories. Wounds that need air. Truth that never found words before. Berta encourages it. "Put it down," she says. "Even if no one reads it, and maybe no one will." But that's not the point. The point is, I'm still here. Still thinking. Still becoming. We rearranged some rooms. Berta made a study for herself, and I moved into a smaller bedroom by the garden. It was her idea. "Easier for you to get to the terrace," she said. But I knew it was more than that. She wanted me closer to the light. And every morning, when the sun pours through the glass, I think she was right. This house was once my whole world. Now it's a chapter. A place where something ended and something else, quiet, strong, unshakable, began. I no longer fear the closing of each day. I welcome it, like a gentle hand resting on my shoulder, reminding me that I've done enough. One morning, while sitting by the garden window, I heard Lucia laughing with Berta in the kitchen. They were talking about paint colors for the hallway. Pale blue or warm ochre. I closed my eyes and simply listened. Their laughter was effortless, unburdened by the weight of inheritance or old expectations. I realized then that I was no longer the center of the house, and for the first time, I felt relieved. That afternoon, I asked Berta to bring me my sewing kit. I hadn't stitched in years, but my fingers remembered the rhythm. I began repairing an old cushion cover from the library chair, not because anyone asked, but because it felt good to create again. Berta passed by and paused at the door. "What are you making?" she asked. "Memories," I replied with a smile. "Ones that don't hurt." We started having more people over. Just a few friends, some from Berta's world, some from mine. We shared meals under the fig tree, drank wine, exchanged stories. There was no division between guest and host. No whispered judgments about who belonged where. That house, once a fortress of appearances, had become a place of presence. One day, a former employer of Berta's came by unannounced. A woman from her past who used to treat her like furniture. She arrived dressed in arrogance and left in silence. Berta had welcomed her kindly, offered tea, even a slice of cake. But when the woman asked, "And what do you do here now?" Berta answered, "I live here." That was all. Nothing more. And yet everything had been said. I kept writing. Pages filled quickly now. Not just memories, but reflections on time, on silence, on what it means to reclaim your own story. I told Berta I wanted to leave them for someone to find someday. Maybe a stranger, I said. Someone who needs to know that endings don't always look like endings. She nodded and said she'd make sure of it. We added a bench near the old olive tree. It had always been there, gnarled and half forgotten. But I asked Berta if we could clean the area around it. She agreed, and one Saturday morning, we cleared weeds and leaves, uncovering stone pots we didn't know were there. It felt symbolic, like brushing the dust off something still alive underneath. Sometimes I catch myself thinking of Ricardo as a little boy. He used to run through these halls in socks, sliding on the polished floors. Anna loved the attic. She'd build forts with old sheets and pretend it was a castle. They weren't always cruel, but somewhere along the way, they grew sharper than I could hold. And I, too proud, too silent, never stopped them. Now, I let the memories come, but I don't let them stay too long. I've made peace with the fact that not all things heal. Some just settle quietly, like leaves on still water. And that, too, is a kind of peace. Berta started keeping fresh flowers in every room. Not fancy bouquets, just wildflowers or whatever was blooming in the garden. I never asked her why, but I think I knew. It was her way of marking the space with life, of reminding both of us that even in a house filled with memories, something new could always bloom. I caught myself smiling every time I entered a room and saw a single daisy in a glass. One morning, I found an envelope on my breakfast tray. It was from Lucia. She had written me a letter thanking me, not just for the house, but for what I had done for her mother. "You gave her more than a home," she wrote. "You gave her back to herself." I pressed the letter to my chest and wept silently, because in giving away what I thought defined me, I had helped someone else find what defined them. Berta started talking about the future in a way she never had before. Not in vague what-ifs, but in real plans. She wanted to start a foundation, something small, to support women like her, domestic workers who had spent their lives invisible. They don't need pity, she said. They need dignity. I looked at her, and in that moment, I saw not a maid, not even just a friend, but a woman who had become powerful without ever raising her voice. We spoke with Don Mateo about it. He agreed to help with the legal side. Berta was nervous. She had never handled anything like this before. But she took notes, asked questions, listened carefully. "You've always been capable," I told her. "You just needed a world that believed you." She touched my hand, and for the first time, didn't call me Doa Teresa. She just said, "Thank you, Teresa." I asked Berta one afternoon if she ever imagined this. Owning a house like this? Building something with your name on it. She laughed gently. "Never. I just hoped I wouldn't die tired." I sat back in my chair, watching the light dance across the tiles, and whispered, "Then we're both doing all right." And we were. As the weeks passed, I felt my body slowing down in a way I could know. Longer deny. The small climbs, the longer naps, the little forgettings. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet whispers of age coming to collect its debt. I didn't feel fear. I felt readiness, like a chapter easing toward its last few lines. And for the first time, I didn't mind turning the page. I started preparing some things quietly. Letters. Instructions. I left them in a box with Berta's name on it. Not out of melancholy, but love. I wanted her to know what mattered. What could be sold? What must be kept? I didn't want to be another weight she had to carry alone. When I told her about it, she wiped her eyes and said, "I'll carry what you leave with both hands." And with pride, the olive tree by the bench began to fruit that summer. Tiny, green olives with a bitter scent. I sat beneath it often, breathing the air, listening to birds, sometimes doing nothing at all. And yet I felt full. Not of pain, not of regret. Just full. As if the house, the garden, the woman beside me, it all finally made sense. I began waking up earlier, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I wanted to hear the house before the world touched it. The slow creak of the stairs, the distant clink of Berta preparing coffee in the kitchen, the doves nesting outside my window. There was something sacred about those early hours. I'd wrap myself in a light shawl, the one with tiny embroidered lilies, and sit by the window with my tea, watching the sun climb through the iron bars of the garden gate like it, too, had lived here all its life. One morning, I asked Berta if she would walk with me through each room. We started at the main entrance, with its heavy wooden doors and the antique brass handle that Enrique had imported from Lisbon. She touched the doorframe as we passed like it was an old friend. In the salon, I showed her the mark on the floor where Ricardo had once dropped a marble lamp, and in the dining room, I told her about the day on a spilled red wine on the white tablecloth during her engagement dinner, and how we all pretended it hadn't happened. When we entered the library, I noticed Berta paused at the bookcase on the left. "You always go to that one," I said. She smiled, pulling out a worn copy of Lorca's Romancero Gitano. "It reminds me of my father," she said. "He used to recite this when the electricity went out." I asked her to read a stanza aloud, and her voice, soft, earthy, textured by years of silence, filled the room in a way no chandelier or velvet armchair ever could. That was the moment I realized this house had always belonged to her spirit. I had simply opened the door. We moved into Enrique's old study. I hadn't touched much in there since he died. The leather blotter still smelled faintly of tobacco and old ink. There was a faded photo of him and me on the desk, taken in 1973 at a cousin's wedding. "He never smiled with his teeth," I muttered. "Said it made him look foolish." Berta looked at the photo for a long time. "He looks proud of you," she said gently. And just like that, something tight in my chest let go. In the back pantry, I told her how I used to sneak sweets at night, hiding jars of membrillo behind the flour tins. "I wasn't always this dignified, you know," I joked, and she laughed, her whole body shaking in that deep, rare way of hers. It echoed off the tile walls and made the kitchen feel warmer than any oven ever had. For a moment, I was 20 again, laughing with someone who truly saw me, not the widow, not the Segura, just Teresa. We ended the walk in the small prayer room at the end of the east wing, a space no one but me ever entered. There were no icons or candles left, just silence and dust motes dancing in the light. "I used to kneel here every Sunday," I said. "Not to ask for anything, but to remind myself I still believed." Berta stepped in slowly and stood beside me. "Do you still believe?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. I looked up at the cracked ceiling and said, "In some things, yes. In others, I believe now because of you." After the tour, we sat in the kitchen and shared a simple lunch: lentil stew, crusty bread, and apple slices dusted with cinnamon. It tasted like comfort, like everything I thought I'd lost but had somehow regained. Berta cut the apples with the same knife she always used, the handle wrapped in tape from years ago, when it cracked, and I watched her hands move with practice rhythm. She wasn't performing. She was home. That night, I lit a single candle in the upstairs hallway and left it burning in a brass holder. That had belonged to my grandmother. It wasn't for prayer. It wasn't for mourning. It was just a light, a silent declaration that even in our quiet corners, we had not been extinguished. The house, too, seemed to exhale. One morning in early autumn, I awoke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the windows. The air had that cool, clean scent only Madrid knows after a dry summer has finally broken. I wrapped myself in my wool shawl, the gray one with tiny frayed edges, and made my way to the sunroom. Berta was already there, wiping condensation off the glass panes. She looked over her shoulder and said, "I was hoping you'd wake up before it stopped." I sat beside her, and we watched the rain in silence, like two old women who had nothing left to prove to the world. Later that day, we received a visit from Father Julian, the local priest. Not because I had summoned him, but because he often came by when the weather turned. He brought oranges from the parish orchard and always asked if he could sit in the chair by the fireplace, as if it needed permission. This time, he noticed something was different. "You seem unburdened," he said, looking at me. I smiled. "Because I am." He turned to Berta and added, "And you, Segura, seem exactly where you're meant to be." She nodded once, and we didn't need to say more. That afternoon, I retrieved the old photo albums from the linen closet. The ones Anna used to love flipping through as a girl, before ambition clouded her eyes. I asked Berta to sit with me while I turned the pages. Black and white weddings, children in stiff collars, summers by the coast in the 60s. "So many faces," Berta whispered. "So many stories." I touched one photo of my mother holding me as an infant. Her hands were delicate and unsure. "We all start small," I said. "Even the ones who think they own everything." As the days shortened, I began to tire more easily. I would sit on the edge of my bed and feel the weight of my bones like never before. Not painful, just present, like time itself had decided to settle in my joints. One night, as Berta helped me with my slippers, I looked at her and said, "If I don't wake one morning, don't panic. Just open the windows and let the house breathe." Her eyes welled up, but she didn't argue. She just said, "If you don't wake up, Teresa, I'll sit with you until the light changes. That night, I wrote final. Letters. 1 to each child, brief but clear. I told them I had loved them, even when they didn't deserve it. I told them not to seek the house in court because the house had already chosen its story. I signed both letters with Mother, not because they earned it, but because I had. Then I sealed them and placed them in the drawer beneath my scarves, where I kept everything that ever mattered. I also wrote one more letter for Berta. Not instructions, not paperwork, just my voice on paper. I told her she was the best part of my final years. That in her, I saw the kind of strength the world too often overlooked. I told her the house was never really mine, not in the way people think ownership works. I had only been its caretaker. She had become its soul. I signed that one not with my name, but simply, thank you. The next morning, I asked her to bring me outside, to the bench under the olive tree. The air was crisp, the sky gray, and the birds busy in the branches. She wrapped me in a blanket and sat beside me, our shoulders touching. I said, let's not speak today. Let's just sit, and so we did. 4 hours. Until the light began to dim, and the cold brushed gently against our faces like a memory leaving quietly. That night, as I lay in bed, I looked around my room. The worn rug beneath the bed, the cracked porcelain basin on the dresser, the faint smell of lavender soap. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, this is how I wanted it to be. Not grand, not loud. Just real. The following day, something in the air felt different. Not ominous, just final. Like a chapter nearing its last sentence. I woke later than usual, my limbs slower to obey, my breath just a little shallower. When Berta entered, carrying my breakfast tray with the usual cup of tea and 2 slices of toast with fig jam, I looked at her and smiled weakly. No need for toast today, I said softly. Just sit with me a while. She set the tray down and pulled the chair close, wrapping her fingers around mine, warm and steady. We sat like that for nearly an hour. No need for words, just a quiet hum of life outside. The swish of trees, a distant dog barking, the faint rattle of a car over cobblestone. I told her I was ready, though she hadn't asked. Don't say that, she whispered. You're still here. I am, I agreed. But now, everything that needed to be said has been. She pressed my knuckles to her lips, and in that gesture, I felt a goodbye already unfolding, not rushed. Not forced, just true. That afternoon, Lucia arrived with a fresh loaf of bread and a little bouquet of marigolds. She kissed my cheek and said, Mama told me you've been tired. I touched her face and said, you take care of her, all right? Lucia nodded, eyes shining. Always, we shared a small meal in the kitchen. Berta made sopa de ajo, and I managed a few spoonfuls, savoring each as if it were my first. Or last. When they walked me back to my room, I asked them to leave the window cracked. Let the house breathe, I reminded them. They tucked the covers up to my chest, placed a lavender pouch near my pillow, and turned off the main light, leaving just a lamp by the nightstand. I heard Berta whisper something to Lucia on the way out, and then silence. A full, peaceful silence that wrapped around me like a shawl. I didn't sleep immediately. I watched the shadows shift across the ceiling, trace the outline of the curtain swaying gently. I thought of my mother's hands, of Enrique's quiet way of clearing his throat when he was nervous, of Anna's giggle as a child, of Ricardo's soft curls before time hardened him. I didn't hate them. I just no longer carried their weight. Sometime in the early hours, I dozed off. And in my dream, I was walking through the house barefoot, the marble floors cool and familiar. Every room was lit, every door open. And at the end of the hallway, there was a figure waiting. Not frightening, just familiar. I walked toward it without fear. I wasn't leaving, I was arriving. The next morning, Berta found me lying still. The window open, the light falling gently across my face. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She sat beside me, took my hand and whispered, "Thank you for not letting the world define how the story ended." Then she opened the shutters wide and let the morning pour in. Later that week, they held a small memorial in the garden. No priests, no marble tombs, no long speeches. Just stories, laughter, a table with my favorite teacups and wildflowers in jars. Lucia read aloud from one of my notebooks. Berta wore her navy dress. And the house didn't mourn. It stood tall, proud, still full of life. In the weeks that followed, Berta continued living in the house, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as a rightful keeper of its walls. She didn't change much. The furniture stayed where it had always been. The curtains still smelled faintly of my perfume. But little by little, she left traces of her own, framed photos of Lucia, new books on the library shelves, soft music playing in the afternoons. The house didn't resist. It welcomed her. Neighbors eventually stopped whispering. They began to wave when passing the front gate. Some even brought baked goods, asked about hosting readings in a salon, or sought help with their aging parents. Berta never boasted about what had happened. She simply said, "I cared for a woman. She trusted me. That's all." And it was more than enough. One day, Berta found a letter I had forgotten to mention. It was tucked inside an old jewelry box beneath a velvet pouch of broken brooches. In it, I had written, "This house was never about stone or status. It was a mirror. And you reflected back the best of it." She read it slowly, aloud, as if I were there. And for a moment, maybe I was. She kept the bench under the olive tree exactly as it was. And sometimes at sunset, she would sit there with a book in her lap, gazing at the leaves turning. Gold Lucia joined her now and then. They talked about recipes, about the foundation they were building together, about the laughter that still echoed in the tile corridors. The house, once so heavy with history, had learned to breathe again. Berta opened the east wing eventually, turned it into a small reading room for retired women in the neighborhood. Every Wednesday, they gathered with coffee and short stories. They said the house had good energy, that it felt lived in, but peaceful. No one knew the full story, and Berta never offered it. Some things, she believed, were sacred in their silence. The day the foundation launched, Berta stood in front of a small crowd in the garden, under strings of warm light and the scent of lemon blossoms. She spoke softly, but with certainty. "This is not about charity. It's about memory. About all the women who were told their place was behind someone else." Today, we stepped forward. Lucia held her hand. The guests applauded, and above them, the house watched in silence. I wasn't buried in marble. That was never my wish. My ashes were scattered in the garden, near the olive tree, where my voice had once found its final calm. Berta placed a single stone with no name, just an engraving. She stayed until it was hers to leave. And so it was that a house once meant for legacy became a home built on loyalty. Not blood, not expectation, but presence. And if you ever pass by that corner of Madrid, and you see a woman sitting beneath an old olive tree, look closely. She's not alone. Sometimes, what defines a legacy isn't what we leave behind in stone or paper, but who stood beside us when no one else did. Teresa's story isn't just about a house or even betrayal. It's about the quiet power of being seen, and the courage it takes to give everything to the one who never asked for anything in return. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, maybe a mother, a caretaker, or even yourself, feel free to share what it stirred. In you. Sometimes, saying it out loud is how we begin to heal. And if you know someone who's lived something like this, maybe share this video with them. It might help them feel less alone. We often wait for a moment to reclaim our voice. But as Teresa showed us, it's never too late to say, "This is mine and this is what I choose." If this kind of story speaks to you, and you want to hear more real voices like hers, you're welcome to stay close.